This video is all about relighting a kitchen. Coming into a kitchen that has a lighting situation that's just not ideal and rethinking it, reimagining it, and redoing all the lights. The thing you need to know about this kitchen in particular is that there's no access above, so you can't get into the attic. And the new setup is going to have a couple pendant lights right there. All these can lights are going to go away. Like there's a million can lights in there and they're all going to be eliminated. Where you see these little post-its, there are going to be some new kind of minimalist LEDs. Let's see, there's a flush mount light that's going to go away, that kind of old school light there. There's going to be a hanging pendant over the sink just to kind of add some dimensions to the kitchen. And there's also going to be some under cabinet lights. All right, so once that layout was all mapped out, I started digging into the can lights. As I mentioned, all the can lights needed to be removed, but I didn't want to remove their wires. Like all the wires, as you can see here, are really important. Like the wires are going to be used for future fishing and future lines and future circuits. However, the canisters themselves, like the steel up above, does need to be pulled out so that you can create really good patches for these holes. Now, typically, if you had an attic space, you could just go up there and yank out your can lights. But working from down below is a little bit tricky. You've got to figure out a way to either cut those can lights apart or just bust them. And I went for that second option. Taking the can lights down, like pulling them down, pulling them out, and then the housing up above, I had to kind of break it apart. And in some cases I could remove it, in other cases it had to stay up in the cavity spaces. The most important part is right there though, pulling that wire out. All those wires are useful and create a kind of network of connections that you can use for the new lights. All right, now existing power sources are really important in a project like this. And here I've got a single gang, like one switch outlet, and I'm switching it into a 2-gang outlet. So I can take that power source and branch out so that I can power both a pendant light and the under cabinet lights. I just broke out that receptacle box and I will install a new one that's a 2-gang outlet. If you do this work, you got to get big receptacle boxes, like the deepest receptacle boxes you possibly can. I would also recommend marking your wires. So this is the feed in. I've got it marked with some black tape just so that you keep everything straight, tidy, clean. This could potentially be a really messy job that gets confusing on you with all the wires everywhere. So the more you mark things and keep notes, the better you're going to be. All right, so what you're going to see here is the setup, kind of like the rough wiring setup on the under cabinet lights. And all of these need to be fished, and there are really like a couple ways to fish under cabinet lights. One is back behind the cabinets. Another is down through the crawl space or basement. And in this case, I went with the crawl space. That's just a kind of cleaner, simpler way to go if you have access to it. And I use my flexi bit to drill holes through the plate at the bottom of the wall. And then down in the glorious crawl space, it's actually not such a bad crawl space. Down in the crawl space, I fish my lines. You could fish your wires up or down, but I opted to fish them from the top to the bottom. That just kind of allowed me to economize on wire. You could go either way. Whatever works for you is great. So I pulled the wires out in the crawl space, detached them from my fish tape, and made sure I had plenty to connect them all together. And then up above, it was just a question of running the wire underneath the cabinet. The insulation on this house had a vapor barrier, and I repaired that vapor barrier before moving on to the next under cabinet light. And in all, there were four of these under cabinet lights, and one of them is right next to the switch. So this one right here is going to be where the switch is. It'll power this under cabinet light, and then the circuit is connected in the crawl space to power the other ones. And like I said, I try to keep everything tidy when I do this, so marking the Romex isn't going to hurt. Here I was just indicating which wire goes to which place. All right, this is the last of those under cabinet lights, and I'm just going to rough them in right here. A little bit later in the video, I will show you how I finished them all out. All right, so all the under cabinet lights have been fished and pulled through into the crawl space, and they all converge right here. Okay, so I connected all those wires together, stored the connection in a junction box, and then moved on to wiring and fishing all the connections for the ceiling lights. Now, if you're going to fish through a wall and then up into a ceiling, you're pretty much always going to need two holes. One at the top of the wall and one at the corner of the ceiling. Sometimes you can get away with just one of these holes, but in my experience, it's more common that you need two holes, one to come up and one to get over. And if you don't have one of these flexi drill bits, I would recommend you get one for this job. It allows you to not only drill kind of remote holes, but holes that have a little bit of like a curve or an arc to them that are just kind of really nice for getting your wires through. I also sometimes use this boroscope just to see what's going on inside a hidden cavity. These things are not the best. They're kind of annoying. The images are hard to read, but I do pull it out from time to time just to, make double sure if I'm going into a blank cavity, make double sure what I'm getting into. All right, so we got a doubled up stud here. 1, 2, that brings us up 3 inches. And then there is a stud on top of the double just for the drywall. So it'll come down through the stud, through these two, and then be able to snake the wire this way. All right, now this is just a small point, but some of these holes I actually drilled them with my impact driver. That's just because the darn thing is smaller than my drill, and I can fit it up into the ceiling cavities like you just saw. Wire's coming in, comes down this channel, goes through a beam right here, comes out here, you can see up above, and then comes down into the cavity. I'm just going to attach it to the fish and pull it down into the switch. And this is that big receptacle box I was telling you about. This is a 2-gang box that's going to have on the right a switch for the pendant light, and on the left a switch for the under cabinet lights. Both of those are going to be on dimmers, which is why I needed a big box. And then next up is cutting even more holes in this kind of Swiss cheese of a ceiling. These are for these small LED lights that are going to be the new main ceiling lighting system. You can see all those big holes are from the previous cans. All those are going to be patched, but I patched them last, like at the last minute, because they're actually really handy. Any hole in the ceiling is a potential access point that you can use to fish lines, get up in there with your drill and cut through a joist, or even just stick your camera up there to see what's going on inside a cavity. All right, in this case, I actually ran into something and I wasn't sure what was up there. And one thing I do is I just put my phone on flash mode and a timer, like a 3-second timer, stick the phone up in the hole, take a picture. And in this case, I realized there was a bunch of ductwork in the way. So I had to go out of that cavity, into the next one, and then back in on the other side of those joists. All right, so we're finally getting to installing some of those ceiling lights. There are a bunch of different types of LED ceiling lights that you can buy. These are spring-loaded, and they're for what's called old work. So they're for retrofitting an existing room, kind of like I'm doing right here, where you don't have access from up above. You can get lights that have the junction box on top of the light, or lights that have the junction box separate. I would recommend you get the ones that are separate. These end up being a little bit heavy with the junction box on top of the light, and sometimes it overloads those springs a little bit and the light kind of sags. All right, but with that said, the lights ended up looking pretty good, and there is one circuit of ceiling lights. And then next up, I started installing a couple of pendant lights. The pendants are gonna hang from independent ceiling boxes. And again, these are old work boxes. These have some little wings that kind of flip out when you stick them in the hole. And that holds the box to the drywall without having big spreaders that link joist to joist. All right, so it's finally time to do some patching that crazy set of holes in this kitchen. Don't fool yourself. If you are doing a lighting job like this, it's not really a job that is totally about wiring. I mean, wiring and the electrical system is part of it, but a big part of this job, and really where the rubber hits the road, is in your drywall patching. Get some practice. Knock some holes in your garage wall and patch them. You're going to need some experience patching drywall if you get into something like this. You can see there's a lot of holes to patch, and you want them all to be really clean. Like, you want them all to look really, really good. So this part of the job takes extra time. There are a lot of ways to patch drywall, a lot of kits out there and products and whatnot. I do it in a really basic way where I put some plywood, wood, or in this case particle board, back behind the hole, and then screw my patch to the particle board. The patches themselves are different sizes. Some of these were 6-inch circles, some were 6.5-inch circles, etc. There are also a lot of ways to mud your patches. You can use paper tape or fiberglass tape. I tend to use fiberglass tape just because there's no chance of air bubbles. Paper tape has a chance of an air bubble. You can get it perfect, but I tend to get better results with fiberglass tape. Maybe it's just a personal preference. I also do a lot of really thin layers of mud. I know a lot of people patch drywall in different ways, but what I do is I do a really thin layer, a layer of fiberglass tape, then another really thin layer, and as you'll see, I follow that up with multiple subsequent layers until I feel like I've got a really nice smooth finish. The other thing to mention about this drywall repair is that it takes several days to do repairs like this. What you're seeing right now is the first coat, like the first run of mud, and that thing's got to dry. I usually let it dry 24 hours. Sometimes you can get away with 12 hours if you've got a really dry, like low humidity situation, but 24 hours later, I'm doing another coat, and then sometimes another day later, I'm doing yet another coat. But at least 3 days to get the primer on if you're using this method. All right, so with that first course of mud drying, I went ahead and installed those under cabinet lights I was talking about. And I didn't buy dedicated under cabinet lights. Instead, I've been going with these puck lights. And I think it makes a really clean setup. You can get a lot of gimmicky under cabinet lights these days with like remote controls and 300 colors and flashing and all that. This instead is just a straight up puck light that is wired to 110. So you don't need a transformer or anything. You do need a junction box to make your connection, and I bought these little kit boxes on, I think it was Amazon. I'll put a link down below, either Amazon or eBay. Electricians out there will notice that they do not have a locking connection to the junction box, but other than that, they're pretty sweet. They provide a really kind of low profile, minimal connection that you can hide under your cabinet. so the lights go in, there's a connection inside that job box, and then I just cover any exposed wire with some surface mount conduit. This stuff comes in metal or plastic of various kinds. I like this two-part system because you can snap one section in underneath your wire, make sure it's just right, and then click the top on top of your wire before you make your connections. All right, so with the lid clicked onto that little job box, there is a look at your under cabinet light. And then this is another one that I put in at a slight angle just to get the light exactly where I wanted. So they're kind of flexible. You can run long spans or short. And then here are a couple of those dimmers going in. One will dim the under cabinet lights, which are dimmable, which is nice. And the other will dim one of the pendant lights. All right, second step on the drywall repair is to sand everything smooth before laying another coat. You can put another coat right on, but I found that little rough bumps and bubbles and stuff will just kind of get accentuated in your second coat if you don't sand first. So I do a first coat, I sand, and then I put down my second coat. And then the next day I was sanding yet again. I liked the results, it looked pretty smooth. And then it was finally time to roll on some primer. And then I hung just a couple of the pendant lights, and these were 30 inches off the countertop. If you are doing pendant lights, I would recommend you sort of experiment with some different heights. All right, here's a final look at these lights. The thing about looking at lights at the end is that it's always kind of underwhelming because, you know, it just kind of looks normal. But anyway, we've got 2 straight rows right here of dimmable LEDs. These 4 right here are on one circuit, and these 2 are on another. And then I've got 2 pendants here. There's only one hanging right now. These guys are building a new island, and at that point we'll put the second pendant in. And then there's a pendant over the sink. And then of course you've got the under cabinet lights. Alright, thanks for checking out the project. Hit me with a comment down below if you have questions, suggestions, or whatever, and I'll see you in the next build video.